Up to this point, we've been focused on a contradiction between what the public was told and what institutions quietly studied, a contradiction between certainty presented outwardly and uncertainty managed internally. But contradictions on their own are abstract. They live in documents, budgets, and archived programs. They live in language, policy, and classification tiers. They can be argued about from a distance as if they're only ideas, things that exist safely on paper, detached from consequence, and detached from people. Everything changes when unresolved questions stop being theoretical and begin to affect real people. Because once anomalies move from reports into lived experience, dismissal becomes far more difficult to sustain. It's one thing to ignore a document. It's another thing to ignore something that shows up in someone's life, someone's body, or someone's memory. This is the point where institutional curiosity intersects with human reality. For decades, reports emerged that did not remain confined to radar screens or intelligence briefings. They entered homes, landscapes, communities, and individual lives. And those experiences did not behave like imagination. They didn't feel like random. They didn't scatter in every direction. They followed patterns. Patterns that were noticed, documented, and quietly monitored, even when no explanation existed. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Across different regions, cultures, and time periods, people reported encounters that shared striking similarities despite having no connection to one another. Objects appearing and disappearing without sound or visible propulsion. Environmental disturbances without obvious cause. Sudden psychological symptoms following unexplained events. Disorientation, missing time, altered perception, reported by otherwise healthy individuals who had no prior history suggesting instability or fantasy. And these accounts were not limited to civilians. They included military personnel, law enforcement officers, pilots, medical professionals, and scientists, people trained to observe, document, and assess reality under pressure, people whose careers depend on accuracy, people whose credibility is built on consistency and restraint. That matters because when those kinds of witnesses begin reporting similar anomalies, something changes. The presence of credible witnesses did not produce public acceptance. It produced internal concern because credible witnesses remove one of the most convenient explanations: unreliability. When trained observers report experiences that do not align with known models, institutions face a problem they cannot easily deflect. They cannot dismiss the witness without implying their own systems failed. They cannot explain the event without admitting uncertainty, and they cannot allow uncertainty to spread unchecked. So instead, they document quietly. This is where the language shifts. Publicly, anomalous experiences are framed as psychological stress, misinterpretation, coincidence, or error. Privately, they are recorded as unresolved incidents. Not proven, not disproven, unresolved. And that category matters because unresolved cases do not disappear, they accumulate. They stack over time, layer after layer, year after year, until ignoring them becomes a choice rather than an oversight. As they accumulate, patterns emerge. Reports begin clustering geographically. Symptoms repeat, environmental effects recur, witness experiences align in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. These patterns do not provide answers, and that's important to say clearly, but they do provide consistency. And consistency is what forces institutions to pay attention, because imagination is not consistent across strangers. Coincidence does not repeat with the same contours for decades, and purely internal experiences do not keep producing external traces. One of the most unsettling aspects of these encounters is their impact on the human body. Witnesses repeatedly report physiological effects following unexplained phenomena: headaches, nausea, neurological disturbances, burns, rashes, disruptions in sleep and memory, changes in perception, long-term health consequences that persist well after the initial event. These are not vague impressions. They are measurable responses that appear again and again. Medical professionals documented these effects because they had to, not because they understood them, not because they wanted to engage with controversial subjects, but because bodies were responding to something real enough to leave a mark. A body does not respond to imagination the same way it responds to exposure. The presence of physiological effects eliminates the simplest explanations. It doesn't identify the cause, but it confirms interaction. And once physical effects are involved, the issue is no longer philosophical. It becomes operational. It raises questions about safety, about exposure, about unknown technologies or unknown conditions, about risks that cannot be addressed through reassurance alone. Questions institutions cannot afford to ignore, especially when responsibility for public safety, national security, or infrastructure is involved. This is also where public dismissal often becomes more aggressive. When experiences challenge foundational assumptions, ridicule becomes a defense mechanism. It protects existing worldviews, it reassures stability, it compresses complexity back into something socially manageable. If an experience can be made absurd, then it never has to be examined. If a witness can be turned into a joke, then the report can be discarded without consequence. But ridicule does not stop investigation, it redirects it. Law enforcement agencies quietly logged reports they could not categorize. Military units compiled encounter summaries without public explanation. Medical files recorded anomalies without clear diagnoses. Researchers collected testimony without frameworks that could comfortably be contained in. The common thread was not belief, it was uncertainty. And uncertainty is not ignorance. Institutions understand the difference. Another recurring element in these experiences is environmental disruption. Certain locations generate repeated reports over time, not because people seek them out, but because something about those environments produces anomalies, electrical interference, unexplained sounds, visual distortions, sensor malfunctions, biological effects on animals and humans. These locations attract attention not because they are dramatic, but because they are consistent. Consistency turns curiosity into concern. Concern leads to monitoring. Monitoring leads to documentation. Documentation often leads to silence, not necessarily because institutions want to hide something, but because they do not yet understand what they are observing. Public narratives thrive on explanation. Institutions often operate without it, and that gap creates tension. People who encounter anomalies are told they imagine them. People who report effects are told they misunderstood. Communities are told stories are folklore. Witnesses are told certainty matters more than observation. Meanwhile, files grow, reports stack, patterns persist, and over time, trust erodes, not all at once, but gradually and quietly. When people are told their experiences are impossible, they stop reporting. They stop asking, they stop sharing, not because events stop happening, but because dismissal becomes predictable. This is how anomalies fade from public awareness while continuing to exist in institutional records. And this is why a lack of reports can be misleading. Silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means deterrence. This series exists to restore visibility to that process, not to provide answers, but to show that experiences often preceded explanation, and in many cases, explanation never arrived. The question is not whether every reported experience is accurate. The question is why so many experiences follow similar patterns across time, geography, and culture, and why institutions continue documenting them long after publicly dismissing them. That is not how imaginary phenomena behave. That is how unresolved phenomena behave. Unresolved phenomena produce three things consistently: repeating reports, lingering effects, and uncertainty that cannot be fully closed. Once those appear together, institutions respond predictably. They contain the problem, they categorize it, they separate it from ordinary channels, and they manage it procedurally. This is not a dramatic movie plot. It is procedural, and procedure reveals seriousness. Procedure requires resources, training, protocols, internal justification. Someone inside the system has to argue again and again that the problem remains active, that it hasn't gone away, that it still matters. These experiences also frequently involve disruption to perception and memory. Witnesses report missing time, disorientation, confusion around sequence, a sense that something has occurred that does not fit normal narrative structure. This is not presented as proof, it is presented as a pattern, a recurring feature across unrelated cases, and repeated features are exactly what institutions track when causes remain unknown. This is where the boundary between external events and internal effect becomes unstable. If an encounter produces physiological symptoms, the body becomes part of the evidence. If it alters perception, the mind becomes part of the evidence. And when both occur together, the traditional separation between physical and physiological become harder to maintain. Public narratives do not handle that well. They prefer compartments. Physical is physical, psychological is psychological, technology is technology, consciousness is consciousness. But unresolved phenomena do not respect compartments. They overlap, and overlap demands new models, or denial. Denial is much easier. So, the public receives simplified certainty, and the file continues to grow quietly behind the scenes. This episode marks that transition. The contradiction is no longer just about what was studied. It becomes about what was experienced, because once real people are involved, dismissal carries a cost. Dismissal does not erase what happened, it only removes it from public visibility, and the result is a split reality. One reality contains official language, the other contains lived experience and institutional records that quietly follow it. And that split is important. Because when a society treats an entire category of experiences as impossible, it trains people to mistrust their own observation. That training has a cost. Over time, the culture does not lose anomalies, it loses the ability to discuss them. Institutional records do not need social approval, they need operational clarity, so unresolved cases remain open, details remain preserved, uncertainty remains labeled. That is why unresolved is important. It is a holding pattern, experience stored until a model arrives, or until culture can tolerate the question. That is what this series is tracing, not conclusions, not belief, a split between what can be said and what is recorded. And once that split becomes visible, the series can move forward with clarity. Because clarity changes how evidence is weighed. It changes why patterns matter. It changes why repetition is more revealing than any single dramatic claim. Once a phenomenon repeats across independent witnesses, locations, and decades, the burden shifts. Not toward belief, but toward new information. And when new information lags behind experience, institutions track the gap quietly, because gaps are where risk hides.